Okay, so essentially, the second question that I set you recently wasn't answered particularly well. So just quickly going to go through on kind of expectation. What would we looking to include? A bit disappointing, really, because we've covered it a few times, hence why I'm covering it again. Um, but you'll remember that I've said to you a number of times that the situation got worse before it got better for the working class. So the picture on the left-hand side of mob football and the picture on the right-hand side of association football, the rational form, the same game, it wasn't just a case that people moved to the cities and then suddenly they stopped playing this game and then started playing this game. So what we're interested in is why these types of mob games declined and then why these types of rational recreation kind of took off and replaced them. In order for these to flourish, mob games had to die out. So the picture you've got here is of a smock race, so a kind of pre-industrial form of athletics that was done through wakes and fairs. But why did these kind of things start to decline in popularity amongst the working class? Now, firstly, there was mass urban migration, so people moved from the rural areas where they'd been living into the newly formed kind of urban areas where they would work in the factories, live in the area, socialise in the area, and really attach themselves to a new kind of way of living. First and foremost, that mass urbanisation led to a lack of space. So whereas the popular recreational things like mob football were done in wide open spaces, if you think about Hellerton and Medbourne, it was played that bottle kicking in the countryside in between the two villages. In the urban areas, there was no space for this mob football to continue. Secondly, they actually worked more in post-industrial times immediately after the kind of urban migration. So in pre-industrial times, they worked from sunrise to sundown. In that move to the urban areas, they worked in factories. They were working longer hours because of machine time. So as long as the machines were running, people could work, and they had to work long hours and they had to work hard. So they didn't have the time to take part in the kind of pastimes that they used to take part in, nor did they have the energy. But equally, the factory owners discouraged them. They didn't want to give them time off for the holy days where they would traditionally take part in these wakes and fairs, but equally they didn't want to take part in things like mob football because they were violent and people got injured. Therefore, they were unfit to take part in work. And the rivalries that existed in the kind of rural areas disappeared. So whereas in bottle kicking, Hallerton and Medbourne were playing against each other, the people living in those areas are then migrated to urban areas. The rivalry between Hallerton and Medbourne starts to dissipate, and when they move to urban areas, they haven't got that rivalry. There's an increase in law and order, which we'll touch on in a second. And one of the reasons is because of the influence of the middle class. So they were less tolerant of violence in society. They didn't want people to be behaving in the manners associated with these mob games. So the violence associated with mob football, but equally the drunken, unruly behaviour associated with the wakes and fairs, which were the kind of precursor of athletic competition, or went hand in hand with the mob football games. And then equally the police force. So if there was unruly behaviour, people would be arrested for it. So they clamped down on excessive behaviours that were associated with the games. And then the RSPCA. So the RSPCA clamped down on the blood sports that the working class took part in. So they let the upper class continue to take part in things like fox hunting and hunting, but they clamped down on the blood sports like the cockfighting, things of that ilk, which meant that obviously that was another pastime that they could do. And sport began to be organised as well, which we'll allude to later. They were pushed into that, and as they became more literate and education levels increased amongst the working class, they understood the more rational forms of the game, therefore they were able to access them. The picture you've got here is then of a more rational form of athletics, and these forms of athletics, of football, of cricket, of swimming, were all starting to be encouraged. First and foremost, the codified rules were clamped down on the violence that were associated with mob games, so that appeased the middle class and was acceptable for the working class to take part in those. Secondly, well, we just mentioned it, the rational forms of these sports fitted the middle class ideal, so they were encouraged to take part. They built desirable characteristics. So if you go back to the characteristics that were deemed to be desirable amongst British gentlemen that were developed through games in the 19th century public schools, the 19th century public schools developed those games and created the rational versions. Therefore, they were deemed to be character developing for them to take part in. So it made the working class better. The factory owners, whereas they didn't want their workers to take part in mob games, actually wanted them to take part in rational forms because they wanted a fit and more productive workforce. So the risk of getting injury wasn't as high, but equally they were fit and they were healthy, therefore they were more effective and they produced more work. The factory owners helped this by creating factory teams. So, things like Millwall being a football team developed from the local marmalade works. And the church wanted their parishioners to take part in the rational forms because, again, they created muscular Christians, a term that you will have heard before. So, the church created their own football teams. Aston Villa was a church football team that was created for people who were in that parish to play football. They had more free time, so things like the Saturday half day, the early closing movement, it meant that they had more free time in which they could take part in rational forms of sport, but also because they were working less hours, they had greater energy which they could put into the pursuit of playing sports, pastimes, and games. Better transport, obviously things like the steam engine meant that people could travel. They could travel to the seaside, they could take part in sea bathing, which was deemed to be therapeutic. But obviously with transport, it meant that teams could travel further and then they could take part in national competitions. So in 1888, you had the advent of the English Football League. In 1873, the FA Cup set up as a national competition, and they were encouraged to take part in these. And lastly, we had purpose-built facilities. So whereas the mob football games and the mob games died out because of the lack of space, actually what we had here, as denoted by the picture here, is purpose-built facilities for the rational forms of the game to be played in.